Mini episode 950 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Welcome to mini episode 950 of the FDH Lounge. I'm FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here today with a special segment on many levels. We're unveiling the balloting for the FDH Lounge top NBA players of all time. With LeBron versus Jordan and the Big O's triple-double in the spotlight in the last year, we decided to step in to settle these disputes about who ranks where in our own way. Contrary to our Pantheon voting, which is Vox Populi, we went with the less is better approach. 7 of our dignitaries voted, the most hardcore hoop heads among us. My ballot was unveiled in mini episode number 891 back in October, with my reasoning for each pick broken down. We all voted for a top 10, and were allowed to vote for up to 5 honorable mention. Points ranged from 100 for first place to 25 for 10th place, with honorable mention at 10 points apiece. 2 of our balloters are here to break it down with me. We start with a peek behind the curtain. We don't always post segments on the day we're recorded, but today we are. It's January 14th, 2018, the 11th anniversary of the FDH Lounge. 11 years ago tonight, fellow original dignitary Chris Galloway, along with me and a few others, brought up the curtain on the Sports Talk Network mere minutes after the curtain was brought down on Marty Schottenheimer's career with that Chargers choke against New England in the NFL divisional playoffs. He's remained a big part of the show over the years, and this public policy statesman, whose first campaign I ran back in college so many years ago, joins us now, and also Facebook says we became Facebook friends on this date as well. Happy Lounge-iversary, my man.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Rick. I feel like I should hire you to write my biography.
I'm available, and of course there are many chapters yet to be written in that, as we all know. And Chris is joined by another very long-time FDH Lounge dignitary, a colleague of ours from the old Sports Talk Network who makes regular appearances on the likes of WFAN and SNY in New York, and on 97.5 The Fanatic in Philadelphia with our fellow FDH Lounge dignitary, Joe Stazak. He's an expert on the intersection of sports and the law as well as so many other things, and his regular podcast with Joe, Kallas Remarks, and website of the same name spotlights all of that. We welcome back the great Steve Kallas. How are you today, my friend?
All good. It's great to be with you and Chris. Looking forward to this.
This is going to be outstanding. Our other balloters start with 2 guys who it can be said were dignitaries before there were dignitaries. On the Proto Lounge Show reality check on the Sports Talk Network from 2003 to 2005, which brought me out of post-college broadcast retirement, my good friends Ron Glasnap and Dave Adams. Dave is actually a high school buddy, as is his brother Johnny, also a dignitary who's been on some Pantheon panels with Chris. Ben Chu ran the Hoops website, that NBA lottery pick, full-time for many years, and is quite the historian despite his ripe age of 30. And we simply couldn't vote without senior editor Jason Jones, another original dignitary and a Hoops fanatic to his core. So what we're going to start with, guys, is we're going to start by looking at guys who got just token honorable mention votes along the way. As it turns out, there were exactly 25 players who got votes to any degree. I'm going to mention also, going back to mini episode number 891, the 2 guys that I was not able to make room for in my honorable mention, the 2 guys that were the closest, one of whom got votes, one did not. Elgin Baylor and Moses Malone. They were the closest on this for me. Tied for 20th, going in reverse alphabetical order here. John Stockton got 1 honorable mention vote from Ben. Pete Maravich got 1 honorable mention vote from Ron. That's very close to my heart, one of my favorite players of all time, even if I couldn't make room for him. John Havlicek got 1 honorable mention vote from me. Walt Frazier got 1 honorable mention vote from Steve. I'm shaking my fist as a Clevelander. Steph Curry gets 1 honorable mention vote from Ben. I'm shaking my fist as a Clevelander. And Elgin Baylor, he gets 1 honorable mention vote from Steve, who was able to make room for him on his ballot, as I was not. So on that note, I'll start with you, Steve, if you have thoughts on any of the guys here who just made the tail end of our list.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts just quickly. Pistol Pete was one of my heroes when I was growing up, and I'll say on the air, I think he's the greatest ball handler and the greatest passer who ever lived. But this is an NBA top 10 list, and as great as he was, his NBA career, I would call an excellent career, but I would not call it a great career, certainly not a top 10. Stockton and Malone were my two just misses, as you had just misses, so I understand the greatness of Stockton. Havlicek, of course, you know, the Energizer Bunny. Frazier, I wrote a long thing. I think you posted it. I wrote a long thing on Frazier. I'm the only guy who mentioned him. But I will say this quickly. Bill Simmons wrote the basketball book, and in the back of the book, he wrote a thing about Frazier where his father told him, his father was a Celtics season ticket holder, his father told him the greatest backcourt of all time was Michael Jordan and Walt Frazier. And when the book came out, Simmons had Jordan number 1 and Frazier number 31, and even said in the Frazier piece that my father told me that the greatest backcourt of all time was Jordan and Frazier. That's good enough for me. Well, if it's good enough for you, then Frazier should have been much higher. Elgin Baylor was Dr. J before Dr. J. Steph Curry, much as I like him, he's got a ways to go, and my recollection of his last year in the finals is him running away from screen and roll so he wouldn't have to guard somebody else. So that's kind of a negative for me. And I think that's the list of the first 5 you want to go through now, or the first 6, I should say. But all great players, obviously. You got to be great to make this list.
Very much so, and I felt Elgin Baylor was the greatest player never to have won a championship. I believe I noted that when I said he just missed my honorable mention. Chris, you got thoughts on any of those guys?
Well, first, you probably would note that I chose not to do any honorable mentions in my voting, and I did so not to slight anybody, but because I felt that once we got past what I felt were the top 10, then we're getting into that group of about 40 guys that probably are just all-time greats. We all love them for different reasons. Some level of argument can be made for any of them at any point, because they've had great careers, maybe not necessarily based on championships. So I just chose to stay away from the honorable mentions, but I think the list that you have here is pretty spot on.
Well, those are good points by you, Chris. I think that, again, you're getting to a lot of guys that are pretty interchangeable. I think that is an excellent point to be made. As we go a little bit up the ladder, you're going to see a little bit more of the same. Tied for 17th, 2 honorable mention votes apiece. Isaiah Thomas, I presume the original model, 20 points for him. Dave voted for him honorable mention, as did Jason. Tied for 17th as well, Kevin Durant, 20 points. Steve and Ben voting him honorable mention. And again, as I think about it, a guy who probably just missed my list, we tend to kind of sometimes sleep on how long he's been in the league and how complete his record is already. So it was a tough one for me to leave off the list, notwithstanding my thoughts as a Cavs fan. Also tied for 17th, Charles Barkley with 20 points. Dave and Ben giving him honorable mention. So, Steve, you had named one of the 3 guys on this list here. Thoughts on the next 3, if you have any?
Well, I think Durant made my honorable mention because he's coming and he's coming fast. To me, all-time players that are playing now are LeBron and Durant. I would not agree with Curry. Maybe others are coming. But what Durant did last year in the finals, and I know it's only one, but this is a guy who's already won like 4 or 5 scoring titles. What he did at the end of Game 7 is one of those things that propels him, in my view, into at least an honorable mention in this category now, but he's got a lot of years to play. Barkley, one of the greatest players ever not to win a championship, as you said. Isaiah Thomas, incredible player. I have no problems with him here. I don't see him much higher than that, and I did not have him as an honorable mention. But again, you're talking 3 more great players. You
absolutely are. Thoughts on any of those, Chris?
I agree with Steve. In large part, I would also agree with Steph Curry. I see him as sort of our generation's Jerry West. He's going to be a great player, but I don't think he's ever going to get into the top 10 despite all the current hype. As we get into the next grouping of honorable mentions, I'll dive further into my thoughts on Olajuwon.
Okay, excellent, and very, very good foreshadowing on your part as far as mentioning Jerry West, because I'm going to take the next 4 guys together, even though they don't have the same number of points, because they grade out pretty close in terms of points, from 35 points to 30. We start with a tie for 15th, 30 points. That means 3 honorable mention votes apiece. Jerry West. I gave him a vote, Ron gave him a vote, and Steve gave him a vote. Tied for 15th, with 30 points, Hakeem Olajuwon. I gave him a vote, Dave gave him a vote, and Jason gave him a vote. 14th place, the biggest outlier on the entire list as far as where they're at and the number of points that they got and getting them all from one individual. Jason voted for Allen Iverson, 9th place on his ballot. That gives him 32 points and slots him right in 14th place here. The thing I will say about this, and not to say in Jason's defense, because he doesn't need defending, and his arguments are valid, and he's got a lot of guts with the arguments that he makes, is that he is somebody who is a sports romantic. And if you are somebody who is greatly, greatly gifted, I remember him rhapsodizing on the show some years ago about John Wall before he came into the NBA. And to me, one of the criminally underplayed stories of the 2010s is why John Wall is only a 4-time All-Star, why he hasn't been a transcendent player in the NBA. He's been a very good player, an excellent player, but not transcendent. So I realize that I'm spotlighting a case where Jason, at least thus far, is proven to be wrong, and I don't mean to do that. But here were his notes on Iverson. Immeasurable talent, changes the game forever, played like he was built like LeBron in a 6-foot, 170-pound frame. So he voted for Iverson for those reasons, and he did put up a very, very good track record. Again, he was sort of on an island as far as his positioning of him, but such is life. 13th place, Karl Malone, 35 points. That means he got a 10th place ballot from Ben and an honorable mention from Ron. So those four right there. West and Olajuwon tied for 15th, then Iverson narrowly ahead of him, then Karl Malone narrowly ahead of him. There's a big gulf, I should say, between 12th and 13th place here. That's why we're leaving off. Those four guys are bunched pretty closely together. Chris, resume your thoughts there. You had mentioned Jerry West. You thought you had some thoughts on Olajuwon as well.
Well, Olajuwon, since I didn't go the honorable mention route, Olajuwon was, for me, the big debate in my top 10 between him and Tim Duncan. I was, when you look at Olajuwon's career, it wasn't the longest NBA career. But, in the 93-94 season, when he was named, he was the first player to be named MVP of the league, NBA Defensive Player of the Year, NBA Finals MVP, and the first one to do that. And hey, you're a great player when you have a move named after you, the Dream Shake. So, for me, I'm a little disappointed where Hakeem the Dream came in our overall rankings, because I spent a lot of time in my head looking between Tim Duncan and Olajuwon. I gave the nod in my top 10 to Duncan because I felt he did a little bit more and had a longer career than Olajuwon, so I valued that, weighted that. But I suppose if I was going to give an honorable mention nod, Olajuwon would have been my number 11.
Very interesting, and I agree with you on the greatness of him. And as the Simmons basketball book points out, you look at that stretch in the late 80s there, and that Rockets team that lost in the finals to the Celtics in 86, that is one of the great what-if stories, and that the hardcore hoops people in Houston will tell you that those teams with the Twin Towers and John Lucas and some of those guys had the chance to be better than the mid-90s Rockets, which really kind of says something. So, Steve, what are your thoughts on those four guys?
Well, I'll say this. Had Chris put in honorable mentions, as you know, just mathematically, Olajuwon would have jumped a few places there just by adding him. I'll say this, to me, one of the most athletically gifted centers, his footwork still being taught today by him to other young centers. Of course, the game has totally changed. But yeah, he just missed for me. And I don't know if it's partly because the 2 years they won, as you know, were the 2 years Jordan took off to play baseball. That shouldn't take anything away from him as a player. And the stats that Chris just laid out about Olajuwon that year, and of course they beat the Knicks, so I'm more than fully familiar with that whole series. But I will say positively though for Jerry West, he was my debate for number 10. And Jerry West is, look, I'm old. I've seen all these guys play, and I put three of that era guys, Russell, Chamberlain, and Oscar. I put them in the top 5, so you know where I'm coming from. West, frankly, is right there with those guys, but just a shade behind. Never won a championship until Russell retired, so he did eventually get one, as you know. But a great defender, a great player. The logo, So I think he could have been higher, but I had him 11th, and of course, if I moved him to 10th, he probably would have jumped a few places as well. As for Iverson, look, I love the little guy. Iverson, a great player. The reason I don't have him top 10 or even top 15, well, I would agree, and maybe we can debate this another time, Rick, but I would agree with Jason that he changed the game. To me, the way he changed the game was he became the first guy to really carry at will and get away with it. This revolutionized the game of basketball, and it did. And I'm not even trying to be funny, but if you can think back to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you could never even split a double team, because in order to split a double team, you have to change the position of your hand with the ball to literally push it through the double team. And for, from the 40s through the early 90s, that was a carry.
Yeah.
But then it all left. People today, when Monroe came on the scene, oh, look at Monroe, he carries every play. If you watch old Monroe tapes, he's tame compared to what Iverson did. And I can remember still playing in pretty good leagues in the early 90s and seeing guys get into fistfights over carry calls, because that's when it changed, and I think it's due to Iverson. But in terms of heart and playing like LeBron, even though he was 6 feet, I totally agree with that. He just wasn't quite good enough for me. And again, I root for him. I love the little guys. Just wasn't quite good enough for me to make my top 15. As for Malone, you can make a case again. I don't know if he and Stockton are knocked down a little. No championships. It probably shouldn't count for as much as it counts for, but it does count. But arguably the greatest player of all, greatest power forward of all time. I kind of lean towards Duncan in that respect, and that's why on my list Duncan is 10.
Yeah, and Duncan made my top 10 as well, and we're going to get to that now. The next level, I would say, 10, 11, 12. It was very, very close-knit balloting right there. The battle for 10th place, the battle to be in the top 10. I guess this is kind of fitting. And as I said before, there is a big gulf between 12 and 13 on this list. The battle really kind of starts here as far as the top 10 overall. We start with 12th place, Dr. J, Julius Erving, 170 points. I gave him honorable mention. Ron gave him 10th. Dave gave him 10th. Ben gave him 9th. Chris gave him 9th. And Jason gave him 7th. Kind of bunched up there on what we all thought of him. Number 11, Tim Duncan, 176 points, so just 6 points in front of the next spot there. I put him in 8th place. I was one of the friendlier votes to him. Ron gave him honorable mention. Dave, honorable mention. Steve, 10. Chris, 10. Jason, 5. So that kind of helped him a little bit there on Jason's ballot. And number 10, Shaquille O'Neal, 183 points, just 7 ahead of Duncan, just 13 ahead of Dr. J. I gave him honorable mention, as did Ron, as did Jason, as did Steve. But he benefited in particular in making the top 10 from 2 ballots. Ben slotted him 5th, and Dave slotted him 4th. So 2 guys who went out and kind of broke what had been more or less a consensus, catapulted him ultimately into the top 10. So Dr. J, Duncan, Shaq. Chris, your thoughts on those 3?
Obviously, my feelings on number 10 and where I have Tim Duncan. Julius Erving at 12, I had him at 9. For me, when I was a child, I think Dr. J was the first basketball player I ever became aware of. What he could do, I guess to this day in my mind, is still magical. This is where you're going to get into a little bit of controversy with me, because you'll notice in my top 10, there is no Shaquille O'Neal and there is no Will Chamberlain.
Yes. And
that is, and I will acknowledge, a sort of a personal bias. Steve's talking about how much we love the little guys, because they can change the game and they can do so much in a big man's game. Especially the special ones like Iverson or Curry. But I discount, and why they didn't make the top 10, I discount Shaquille O'Neal, even though he made our top 10. Because to me, watching Shaquille throughout his career, and there were moments of greatness, and he won a lot of rings, and he was a larger-than-life figure, to me, he was just an enormously large man that had a narrow skill set and was able to use his physicality, his overwhelming physicality, to be a great NBA player. Not that he is one of the top 10 basketball players of all time. And so I discount a lot of how I think why I think he ends up high in people's ratings. And to some degree, I do the same with Wilt, although his skill set was far greater than Shaq's. I do the same in the sense that he was an overwhelming physical presence in a time when the people he was playing against in the league were far inferior, in my opinion, overall talent and ability. And I wonder about guys like Wilt today if they played today. He'd be a really good player. Would he be more like a Duncan, sort of just scratching that outside top 10? Or would he be this larger-than-life figure that some people consider him to be?
That's a very good question, and I'm sure Steve has some thoughts on these guys and some of the answers to that in his estimation.
Well, I'll save my Wilt stuff until we get to Wilt because he's higher up. But I like a lot of what Chris just said about Shaq. I view Wilt and Shaq very differently. Wilt was an incredible athlete, and we'll get to that when we get to Wilt. But in terms of these three, Dr. J, and look, I'm older than everybody. Not only did I see Dr. J play in the ABA, I saw him play in the Rucker because I grew up in New York. And Dr. J, the problem for me on this list is Dr. J in the NBA was not even Dr. J in the ABA.
Right.
And while I agree he's an all-time great, as an NBA player, not only could I not put him in the top 10, I couldn't even put him in my honorable mention list. So, again, I take nothing away from Dr. J. I agree with the notion that he revolutionized the game, but he revolutionized the game at a level when TV started to come into play. You can still see the ABA dunk contest with maybe the most legendary dunk in the history of the world when he took off from the foul line, the big afro, the whole bit. But as an NBA player, I view him to be an excellent to maybe great player, but not great enough to be on this list for me. Kind of an okay shooter, certainly not a great shooter. Kind of a good defender, but not a great defender. Relied more on his athleticism than in terms of defensive skills and positioning. So I love Dr. J. He's a New York guy, but that's why he wasn't on the list. It was more about picking the top 10 NBA players, which is why Pistol Pete wasn't on my list as well, although I would have Irving higher than Pistol Pete. As for Duncan, the greatest nickname ever, given to him by Shaq, the big fundamental, just a guy who went about his business. If he was a loudmouth who promoted himself, he'd be higher on the list because that's the world we live in the last 20, 25 years. But I agree with the big fundamental. I had him 10th. I had a big discussion in my head for 10th between he and Jerry West, and could have even thrown Elgin Baylor in. You know, a lot of people will say Baylor was Irving before Irving, and I kind of agree with that to some degree. And as for Shaq, I would adopt what Chris said. I put him as an honorable mention because I think it's a true statement, and Shaq said it. Wilt was the most physically dominant player of all time. Shaq was second. To me, there's a gigantic gap in between first and second, and we'll get to that with Wilt. But I think, didn't Durant just say last year when Shaq criticized him during the finals, didn't Durant just say he was bigger and stronger than everybody? He wasn't a great basketball player. So that's kind of what Chris is saying, but I thought he did enough domination and won enough titles as the main man. Don't forget, when he and Kobe won 3, he was the MVP in all 3. That counts for enough to me to put him on the honorable mention list, but not in the top 10.
I agree with a lot of that, and I think my feeling on Shaq was always that Shaq would have been a great, had he played football, he would have been a great, potential Hall of Fame, NFL lineman as well, because of his size and his physicality. He just happened to play basketball. He couldn't hit a free throw. He couldn't shoot from outside. He had no particular skills other than getting the ball close to the hoop and just being able to overwhelm everyone.
Very good point. And he was very effective in what he did, but yes, he was blessed with a lot of natural skills there. And it's kind of fitting, hearing Steve mention Kobe there and talking about that Kobe is actually next up on the list. I'm going to take the next 3 guys more or less together. When you look at how long Kobe was still Kobe, which I would say it took until about 2013, never the same after the first bad injury, but from the end of Shaq's effective career as a star to when that happened to Kobe, it was roughly the same number of years that Shaq was in the league before Kobe came in. So each of these guys had a prime and a pre-prime and a post-prime that was roughly about the same amount of time here. With all the jostling between them in the early 2000s about who was the better player, it's very fitting that they're in back-to-back spots on this list. Kobe comes in at number 9. 248 points. A little bit of a gap again in the balloting between him and Shaq. Shaq had 183 points in 10th place. The ballots for Kobe, I slotted him 9th, Ron slotted him 5th, Dave gave him an honorable mention, Steve said 7th, Chris said 8th, and Jason said 6th. Next up, Larry Bird, 279 points in 8th place. I put him 10th, Ron said 7th, Dave said 7th, Steve said 9th, Ben said 8th, Chris said 6th, and Jason said 8th. I was actually the lowest of the bunch. The thing that I'll say about that is, while recognizing his overall all-around game, which I've actually seen some comparisons recently to a lot of, but not all of LeBron's game, and I would kind of co-sign on that. What hurt him a little bit in my eyes was the back injury, having his career cut short a little bit, as was Magic's, ironically, at right about the same point in time. Neither one of these guys playing the longer type career such that we saw from Jordan and LeBron and a couple of others. That would have definitely boosted him a little bit. Also, Simmons' thing in his basketball book, very interesting, when he talks about how the NBA started getting more athletic small forwards in the late 80s, as opposed to the guys that Bird was playing against in the earlier 80s, and about how his effectiveness against some of these more athletic small forwards was maybe not quite the same. Number 7, Bill Russell, 308 points. I thought I was going to have him lower than most, but I was right in the middle of the consensus. I had him 7th. Ron had him 8th. Dave had him 6th. Steve had him 5th. Ben had him 7th. Chris had him 7th. Jason said honorable mention. And for me, he was the epitome of the point that was made earlier that Chris said about Wilt. I make that point about Russell, of what would he be like today. You look at his game and how it would translate, and again, you have to wonder, in terms of today's NBA, with his body, with what he was able to do at that time, not towering over guys as he did back in the 60s, what his game would translate to. So it's the 11 rings versus that, and to me that sort of put him right in the middle of the spectrum here. If you're taking the greatness on the one hand, the unparalleled winning, versus what would he do today, for me that averaged out to 7th place, and that's exactly where he came in. So Kobe 9th, Bird 8th, Russell 7th. Chris, why don't you take it away, since there's 2 Chowd players on that list?
Thank you. And I know that Larry Bird is lower on Rick's top 10 because of his Chowd bias. It ain't Rick to put anybody in a Boston uniform in the top 10. But this is where the list, for me, starts to get a little more where we ended up as the collective in terms of where I was. Obviously, I had Bill Russell at 7 and Larry Bird at 6, and on our list we had Bill Russell at 7 and Larry Bird at 8. So I think we're starting to, as we get further and further down the list, you start to see where everybody's voting tends to get a lot tighter in terms of their opinion. Jason giving the honorable mention to Bill Russell, let's be honest, that kept him from probably being number 6 on this list.
Right.
But I think 7 is about right in terms of when you look at his game, if you look at the modern game, I sort of wrestled with that myself in terms of where would he be today, maybe a position change, and might have, and that might directly affect his career if he played today. But based on what he did in body of work in the championships, there's no denying Bill Russell's greatness, especially on the defensive end of the floor, where we at times really, really undervalue these great players. When we look at Kobe Bryant at 9, I had him at 8, and I think that's about right. And I think he is the player that is the closest to Jordan in terms of who Jordan was as a player. We're going to spend a lot of time, and everybody spends so much time comparing Jordan to James, and they're just very different players. And so sometimes that's just sort of a false equivalency. Kobe is truly Michael Jordan Jr., and his career and the championships and the assassin mentality gets him squarely into the top 10, number 9 on our list, number 8 on my list. So those are kind of my thoughts on those 3 fellas.
Well, Steve, what are your thoughts? I know you must have a number about them.
Well, I have Kobe a little higher at 7 than 9. Of course, I have Bird 1 lower. I think Chris is right. Once we get here, you're talking about all-time greats, and we can juggle the positions. I had Russell at 5, and I I'd rather speak the most on Russell. I have a brother-in-law who's much older than me. He's like 70 now, and he was the biggest Celtic fan in New York City in those glory days. And if he knew we were doing this right now, he would try and somehow break onto the phone line to tell us we're all nuts because there's no chance that number one could be anything other than Bill Russell. I understand the comparisons, his body then versus his body in the league now. But see, my problem with all of that, and we're going to get to that when we talk about like a guy like Oscar, not Wilt so much because he was dominant in any era. But here's my problem with that. You have to me anyway, one has to consider and understand. So what if these guys, Oscar, Wilt, West, Bill Russell, what if they were born 30 or 40 years later to play in today's game? Maybe Russell would be 7 feet with that athleticism. I don't know. Maybe Oscar would have been 6'7" instead of 6'5". I don't know. So when you talk about the way it is today with nutrition, for example, and I haven't even mentioned, we'll get to Oscar at length when we do him, but the racism that these guys had to deal with on an everyday basis, I think that broke a lot of players back then. Didn't break Wilt, didn't break Oscar, they dealt with it. But the players today, and they still have to go through some stuff, but it's nothing compared to what these guys went through in the 50s and 60s and 40s. So when we say, yeah, if we drop Bill Russell's body into today, I kind of have to agree with that. But he's 5 on my list because he's the greatest winner ever and the greatest defender ever in my book. And look, he played against Wilt all the time, so you can't tell me he couldn't play against anybody today because he could have. As for Bird and Kobe, I had Kobe higher than Bird. Bird's athleticism, obviously, everybody says, oh, he wasn't that great, blah, 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 but he had an incredibly quick first step, and there's a big difference between speed and quickness. And a lot of these guys, like a Wall you were talking about before today, he had speed and quickness, and Iverson had speed and quickness. Bird had quickness, but wasn't fast from point A to point B, and that hurt him a little while he played, and I agree, it hurt him later in his career, but still one of the all-time great trash talkers who backed it up and, was an early three-point guy. If Bird started shooting, another thing when we start talking about three-point shots, as you can see today, they're getting better and better and better. Why? I went to a 4th grade basketball game last year with a 4th grader, and in warm-ups, they're all taking threes. It just wasn't done back then because in the 40s and 50s and 60s into the 70s, what'd you do? You try and throw the ball into the big man. The point was to get a shot close to the basket. So today they say the mid-range jumper is the dumbest shot in the world. It's not a layup and it's not a three. So it's hard once we get there with all of that stuff. The reason I rank Kobe on top of Bird is because Kobe was an incredible defender, and I agree with Chris, the comparisons with Jordan should be Kobe and Jordan, and I would have Jordan above Kobe, not necessarily Jordan and LeBron, but most arguments of the all-time greatest player, because we're in 2017, is going to be, between Jordan and LeBron. I totally disagree with that, as we'll find out in a few picks, but those are my comments.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we move on, I want to highlight this here because you guys will find this funny as I did. Getting together recently to watch a Cavs game with a couple of friends of mine included 2 guys in their mid-50s. So this has something to do with the perspective. It also has to do with the perspective of hating the Golden State Warriors because these guys, it was a real get-off-my-lawn moment of like, the three-point line is destroying today's game. I don't like today's game. It's not as pure as it used to be. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that's pretty convenient. We're all Cavs fans, and you're saying that. Golden State's the team that really changed the game a couple of years ago, so that was kind of amusing. We get up to number 6.
Rick, will you, when you're putting this together, will you take and cut out that segment that Steve just did and have that almost put that on the social media as a standalone? Because I just want to say that was some very well thought out analysis when you look at how society, culture, and other factors can affect these types of lists. When you talk about the social things like racism and bigotry that the earlier players had to deal with, that is absolutely a factor. And when you look at even things, that's a comment that about nutrition and science that you don't even hear anymore because I've never heard anybody talk about that as it relates to to Bill Russell, which is would he be 2 inches taller today? If he was born today, we know from a society that people are taller. And with sports science and all these other things. So, bravo to you, Steve. I thought that was some really good thinking on your part, how you broke all that down in terms of how the eras are different, how we have to sort of evaluate things.
Well, I appreciate that.
I'll tell you what, I'll commit myself publicly to this. I do a fair number of best of compilations. 951 is actually going to be the best guest clips from 851 to 950. Next time I do one on roundtables, that'll be in there. That's a great point, Chris. I will definitely include Steve's breakdown of that. We're going to talk a little bit more individually about the players above this. There was quite a struggle between number 6 and number 5 on the list. Again, fittingly, just like 10, 11, 12, a struggle to get into the top 10, struggle to get into the top 5. This is going to be an interesting one because you had two very different schools of thought on this next gentleman. One school of thought is represented by the three of us here. The other school of thought is represented by the four who are not here, who are the balloters. Oscar Robertson with 356 points. He was 9 back of Will Chamberlain at 365 for 5th place, but Oscar had 356. Here's what the three of us said. I put him second, Steve put him first, Chris put him third. Here's what the other four guys did. Ron and Dave put him 9th. Ben and Jason had him honorable mention. So quite a spread between them. Two things I'm going to bring up about Big O. One is, again, this was one of the things from the Simmons book, is he was, as a player, sort of like Vince Lombardi as far as how hard he was on those around him. We remember Lombardi fondly because he was a winner. Simmons says, hey, look, the fact that everybody around him kind of choked and, couldn't play as well because they were so scared of him. The lack of people skills, is that something that's fair to judge him on? I didn't end up judging him lower because of that, but I can see where other people might. Because, Michael Jordan, he did a lot of the same stuff. He called Will Purdue. He said, you should have been named Will Vanderbilt because you shouldn't be named after a good school like Purdue. But it seemed to be effective when Jordan did it. Jordan seemed to know what buttons to push. Oscar, unfortunately, in a lot of ways was just a jerk to a lot of people, including teammates, and that may have hurt. The other thing is, Ben Chu points this out as a basketball historian, and I think this is very interesting. We remember him for the triple-double for the season and the great consistency of the 5 seasons of averaging out to that, and he was the most consistent high-level superstar of all time. And we remember that he won an NBA championship eventually with Kareem. But we don't, other than that, there are no real standout moments, and you can't even call a triple-double a moment. More than anybody else in the top 10, this is a narrative-driven society we live in today, fairly or unfairly. Where's the Oscar Robertson moments? There just really aren't any relative to the other top players on this list. So I'm going to start with you, Steve. I know you're very passionate about the Big O. You and I did a segment previously where we highlighted your column and where you very effectively said there's no comparison between that. We already covered it in that segment about how Westbrook contrived to get his triple-double last year. But thoughts on the Big O, because you had him number 1 overall, and I know you're very passionate about him, as am I in a lot of ways.
Well, it's hard to talk about Oscar moments when, because of territorial drafting back then, he got stuck on the Cincinnati Royals. So not only was he lost in the national view, and of course the national view was nothing in the 60s compared to what it's become in the last 25 years, he was stuck on a pretty bad team. That's not Oscar's fault. So if you're looking for moments, I don't know, as an MVP, I think he won a couple of MVPs in the All-Star game, which actually meant something back then because everybody tried and it was a big deal. But you're right. I kind of agree with that. But to take him out, and look, I've done shows with Ben. I've done shows with Jason. I think it's a big gap to have Oscar at honorable mention. I think the reason he's 6th is because those guys did have him at honorable mention. To not have Oscar Robertson on the top 10 list of NBA players 30 years ago, today, or 100 years from now, I'm sorry, that's a gigantic mistake. So I don't give you moments. I give you seasons, Rick. I give you 5 seasons where he averaged a triple-double. This is unheard of. If someone did this today, they'd build a statue of him while he was playing. I mean, it's just so far beyond. Let me give you another thing. I read an article where, according to the Elias Sports Bureau, Oscar, in every year of his first 5 years, where collectively, they say, oh, he only averaged a triple-double 1 year. Collectively, he averaged a triple-double for 5 years. According to the Elias Sports Bureau, in every one of those 5 seasons, every one, Oscar had more triple-doubles than the rest of the NBA.
Right.
Think about that. This is Babe Ruth stuff. Oh, Babe Ruth hit more home runs than every other team. This guy had more triple-doubles than the entire league combined. I mean, that's just so unfathomable. I don't know if people quite understand that. One other thing I'll say. the Associated Press voted for the greatest players of the 20th century. These are the writers, right? The Associated Press. They ranked Jordan 1 and Oscar 2. In 2000, the National Association of Basketball Coaches voted for the greatest player of the 20th century. And that result was Oscar Robertson won. So I'm taking the coaches over the writers. And you know the other things I mentioned in my piece, because I'll take my time now because I got less to say about Jordan and James. Jerry West said, Oscar was the greatest player I ever played against, period. It takes up a lot of ground. Now, that doesn't count after Oscar, you know, but I'm just saying, think of who Jerry West played against. Every guy from the 60s and 70s you can think of. And that takes in a lot of ground. Wilt, it takes in everybody. Elgin Baylor, Russell, you know, think of all those guys. And the other thing, more recently in the 2013 interview, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said, I know everyone's talking about LeBron versus Michael. Oscar would have kicked both of their asses. Now, you can never say if that's true or not, but here's a guy who's one of the 10 greatest players of all time saying Oscar, now again, he got his championship with Kareem, so maybe Kareem has a soft spot for him, said he was better than LeBron and he was better than Michael Jordan. So I do think the conversation ends, in my opinion, if we're talking about the greatest NBA player who ever played, it ends with this guy averaged a triple-double in 5 seasons. People go ballistic of what Westbrook did last year, and they were like rigging it so he could get triple-doubles. And when they say 42 triple-doubles for Russell Westbrook beat the 41 Oscar had, Oscar's season was 80 games long. Westbrook's season was 82 games long. I wrote that article that you put up on Westbrook versus Harden versus Oscar. Really? Because there's no comparison. But if Oscar had 2 more games, do you think he might have had another triple-double? We'll never know. But you got to look at all this stuff in context. And really, when I was talking before about racism, my son is in his early 20s. When he sees Oscar talk, he goes, boy, Oscar sounds bitter to me, Daddy. And I say, yeah, but if there's one human being on the planet who has a right to be bitter, I'm sure there are hundreds of thousands of African Americans who do, but if there's one basketball player, it's Oscar. If you saw the Black Hoosiers thing on ESPN, when Crispus Attucks, an old black school, finally won the city title 2 years in a row in Indianapolis, a racist town where he grew up, they didn't get nearly the trip around Indianapolis that all the white winners got. So this goes way back to high school. And through college in Cincinnati, Ohio, sorry. And then through the NBA in Cincinnati, Ohio, sorry. So I'll double again what I said before, because it's more about Oscar than anyone else, what he put up with. And I don't count what he did for the Players Association, and he was the president, and he started a strike, and he was the lead plaintiff in that big case. That doesn't count on the top 10 list, but understand big picture what this man did. As for Wilt, should I be quiet now, or should I jump on Wilt now, because he's my number 2?
Well,
I leave it up to you.
Tell you what, we're going to get to those guys probably next. I want to say something briefly before I throw it to Chris, and that is, just to clarify with Ben, and again, by definition, right, I had Oscar number 2, so by definition, I disagree strenuously with Ben and with Jason. The narrative thing is something he brought up as a historian as far as moments go, and he was speculating why other people don't tend to rate him as highly. For Ben and for Jason, I believe it was, and again, I don't agree with this, but it's defensible at least, is to say, I wonder how he would translate to today's game. It was a little bit of that with them. I disagree strenuously, but I just want to clarify, Ben wasn't ranking him down because of a shallow narrative kind of a thing. He was speculating as a historian why he doesn't get more run and the run that he basically deserves. So he disagreed, again, with me, as did Jason. And to a certain extent, listen, let's not spare Ron and Dave. They put him number 9 also, too. We had them all top 3, 1, 2, and 3. The 3 of us did. So we disagree with all 4 of those guys. Chris, it was laid out pretty good, I think, by Steve there. Or what are your additional thoughts on the Big O?
Well, I can't really top that. I mean, clearly the 3 of us are the Big O fan club. I mean,
yes.
Rick had him 2. I had him 3. So any way you slice that, obviously our opinions of Oscar Robertson are that, regardless of we 3 believe he's one of the top 3 players in NBA history. You know, my feeling is that you look at Oscar Robertson and his wizardry with the ball and in 5 seasons of averaging a triple-double, and can you just imagine what he would command in today's open market contract? I mean, obviously with salary cap and all the rest of that stuff, it'd be max deals every year. And I remember before LeBron James, the argument was always who was the best player of all time. You know, Michael Jordan or Oscar Robertson.
Right.
And then LeBron shows up, and suddenly now we've shifted. And, you know, again, I think that just speaks to his greatness. Rick, when you talk about, you know, how does it affect his standing in terms of what people think of him, you know, look, he has every reason, as Steve says, to be bitter based on, you know, his experience within, you know, American society and today how he would be a massive star and you know, a social, you know, socially he would be, you know, celebrated versus when he played and he wasn't, other than by a very small group of individuals. But, you know, sometimes there are also, Rick, to answer your question, some people are just jerks, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know Oscar Robertson, so I'm not casting any judgment here. I mean, he may be who he is because of his experiences, and he may be who he is because of who he is. But to me, none of that's relevant. He's one of the best 3 basketball players of all time.
I would agree with that, and I always like to throw this out there as a piece of trivia. As a lifelong denizen of America's North Coast, who is the second player in this top 10 list? Obviously, there's LeBron, to play home games in Cleveland, Ohio. That would be Oscar Robertson. The Cincinnati Royals played a handful of home games, quote-unquote, in downtown Cleveland back in the day. So interesting that he doesn't really register in Cleveland sports history in that way. You'd think it would be worth at least a little bit of a footnote, but the next time I hear somebody tell me they went to see Oscar Robertson play when he's in Cleveland would be the first. He never left a footprint here, even with those handful of games every year that he was doing for a stretch. I'm going to take the next 3 guys collectively because we're going to take the top 2 guys collectively as well. We can obviously talk about all these guys at whatever length. 5th place, Wilt Chamberlain, 365 points. As I said, only 9 points above the Big O. A fairly narrow band of balloting on all of these guys, with a few exceptions here and there. Wilt got 5th place vote from me, 6 from Ron. Dave gave him an 8th place ballot. Steve, you put him 2nd. Ben put him 2nd. Jason put him 10th. 4th place, Magic Johnson, 453 points. I put him 6th. Ron put him 4th. Dave put him 5th. Steve put him 8th. Ben put him 4th. Chris put him 5th. Jason put him 4th. A fairly narrow band of balloting, certainly for Magic. We all had a rough consensus there, more or less. Number 3, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the same can be said, 504 points. We all rated him pretty highly. I put him 4th, Ron put him 3rd, Dave put him 3rd, Steve put him 6th, Ben put him 6th, Chris put him 4th, and Jason put him 3rd. So 3 uber household names right there, as you would expect as we get higher up the list. So Steve, I'll start with you. I know you have some thoughts in general on Wilt, but certainly on the other guys as well.
Yeah, well, I'll go on Wilt first because I have him number 2, and while I agree with the Chris analysis on Shaq as the big man, I don't agree with that analysis vis-a-vis Wilt, and here's why. Wilt Chamberlain was a fantastic athlete. See, all you see now when you see Wilt highlights is really like him with the Lakers, where the Lakers coming up court, and he's coming up later, and he's heavier, he's out of shape, was still a very good player, but wasn't quite Wilt. And I'm just going to give you some quick stats. When Wilt came into the league, his first year he averaged 37 and 27 rebounds. His first year. His first 6 years he led the league in scoring. His first 4 years he led the league in rebounding. Flash forward to now when he played the Lakers at the end of the year, when he was at the end of his career, 34, 35, 36 years old. He played all 82 games, and he led the league in rebounding all 3 years, averaging 18, 19, and 18 a year per game for those 3 years. This is a guy, you know the stories, he averaged 50 a game, he scored 100 in a game. When he was criticized for not passing, the next year he led the league in total assists. This is a guy who played 1 year at Kansas, and then he couldn't go to the NBA, so he played with a year with the Globetrotters, and that's how he really became a talented basketball player. You can find video from the late 50s and early 60s of Will getting a rebound, dribbling the ball down the court, and dunking. I mean, it's just, nobody understands what a great guy was. A great triple jumper, was a great high jumper, he was a great volleyball player. So again, what we have today of Wilt is, well, he's kind of slow. He's out of shape. The only reason he averaged what he averaged, 30 a game, is because his last 3 years playing all 82 games, he averaged, this is with the Lakers, including the championship that he won with West, he averaged 20 a game, 14 a game, and 13 a game, and played full season. So really, as Wilt, he probably averaged 33, 34 a game. And here's the final thing I'll say about Wilt. Oh, also had 55 rebounds in a game against Bill Russell, the all-time record. But here's the final thing, and this is apocryphal, but according to Larry Brown, it happened, and I'll just read it out of the article I found. According to Larry Brown, UCLA coach at the time, Magic Johnson was playing against Wilt in the pickup game, and he, quote, called a couple of chintzy fouls in the goaltending on Wilt. So Wilt said, quote, no more layups in this gym. This is Larry Brown talking. And he blocked every shot after that. That's the truth. I saw it. He didn't let one of Magic's shots get to the rim. And the kicker, of course, is Wilt was in his mid-40s when this happened. So there's dominance. There's Shaq dominance. I'm a big, strong guy. But to me, there's Wilt dominance. I'm a big, strong guy who is as athletic as anybody on the court. That's why I vote him too. I'll just quickly speak about Magic and Kareem because you guys have them higher than me. Kareem very well could be the greatest player of all time. The skyhook is the greatest shot ever invented. Magic I love because he changed the game, 6'9", point guard. But the reason he's not higher on his list, as great as Magic was, not a great shooter. And I didn't think he was a great defender. He was a good defender. So that's why Magic and Kareem on my list versus this list are lower. And I've just explained, in my view, why Wilt was higher.
Well, I'll tell you what, a couple things I want to just mention before I flip it to Chris, because I didn't say much about. Again, Wilt is a guy that I agree with a lot of what you're saying there as far as his ability to translate his game. Magic is a guy where all you need to know about him is whenever the conversation comes to point guards, because you look at this list, point guard is the thinnest position on this list. We always say, who's the best other than Magic? He tends to get taken out of the equation here as a non-traditional point guard at 6'9" that changed the game. He's always exempted from the discussion. Like, is John Stockton maybe the best, or Tiny Archibald, or whoever the case may be, aside from Magic? Just the fact that we put him aside kind of says a lot to me. Again, longevity, an issue with me. He might have been even higher, believe it or not, on my ballot, just like Bird, had he played a little longer. And Kareem, I think when I made my ballot originally, I think the thing I said about him is that winning times statistics, if you're going to do that as like a formula, he's probably number one overall. You add in the longevity. Kareem has a tremendous case to be very, very, very high on this list. Not surprising that he comes in at number 3. So, Chris, your thoughts on those three guys?
Clearly, I have high regard for Magic and Kareem. Magic changed the game so many ways in terms of, I was about to say the same thing. We think of point guards, we think of Magic, and then we start to wonder, who else? And Magic being a guy who could play anywhere on the court.
Yes.
A lot like LeBron James. I mean, could just play any position on the court if you needed him to do so. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, listen, if Michael Jordan doesn't ever, finally make his high school basketball team, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar might be the one we're talking about as the greatest of all time, all these years, rather than Michael Jordan. But luckily for the world, Michael Jordan did finally make his high school basketball. Obviously I have them 5 and 4 on my list because I had Oscar at number 3. So there's just no way around the fact that, those are 2 top 5 players of all time. We have them as 3 and 4 on our list. I enjoyed Steve's discussion about Wilt Chamberlain. I was looking forward to sort of being chastised and schooled on the greatness of Wilt. Because Wilt is a player that I didn't give him a top 10 vote. He was certainly, had I done honorable mention votes, 10 honorable mention votes, he clearly, for me, would have been in that mix as well at, somewhere around 11 or so. And I acknowledge that the big struggle for me is not having a lot of tape on Wilt, not having, probably, yes, a bias that I remember Wilt at the end, and he was still great at the end. He was still an excellent basketball player. I've always struggled with Wilt as a player because I look at when he came into the league and who he was playing against, starting in '59, and the quality of the players. I always felt like, this is a guy who was, it's almost like if there was time travel, was born well before he should have been, and was playing against Lilliputians and people that were just, physically inferior, and almost like as if it was just, totally unfair. It's like Superman, taking on, the three of us in a boxing match. It's not fair. So I don't think you can totally discount what I say about that. Was he a great player? Yes. His ability, you talk about the year when he led the league in assists because he was criticized and he wanted to make a point. Again, I think that also speaks to some of the poor quality of his competition. And probably also of the roster around him, where he was, in many ways, a lot like what LeBron has had to do and been able to do through the years in terms of the many of the inferior rosters that he's been surrounded by, especially with the Cavaliers. It allows, I think there is a certain level of inflation of statistics when someone is sort of carrying, the entire load for a team. You combine that with, inferior competition. Again, does that mean that Wilt is still not probably a top 10 player of all time? Oh, I think his skill set is amazing, and yes, he probably should be. I acknowledge that I always have struggled with putting in so high because I look at that level of competition, late 50s through the mid 60s, and think, really? I mean, today, would he have the opportunity to be as dominant? And not that he couldn't be, but would he even have the opportunity? So,
well, if I could just speak to Rick just briefly on Magic and Wilt.
Sure.
First on Magic, and again, I agree, changed the game, 6'9" point guard, lots of championships. With all that. The problem, though, that I would point out is when West played, when Oscar played, there was no point guard and shooting guard. These guys were incredible point guards, incredible shooting guards, excellent defenders, even West more so than Oscar, I would say. As for Wilt, yes, I agree with what Chris said about the caliber of the competition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let me say this. The centers today are a joke compared to the centers when Wilt played. First of all, there's no Bill Russell, and Bill Russell played Wilt. Wilt crushed him statistically. Bill Russell won. That's why I think Russell would be fine today as well, because he was incredibly athletic, and there aren't that many good big guys anymore. But not only was Russell in the league, Nate Thurman. Nobody ever talks about Nate Thurman, top 50 all-time player. Great center. Zelmo Beatty. Less people talk about Zelmo Beatty. So I think Chris is right in terms of you showed up to play against the Knicks and were playing against Darryl Imhoff when he was the Knick and scored 100 points. I get that. But this is I'll use Ruthian again for Oscar's triple-doubles more than the league and Wilt statistics over time. Ruthian, but yes, you're right. I'm sure there are games he showed up and said, I'm getting, fill in the blank tonight. But even the year he averaged 50, he had to play against guys like Russell. And you played these guys a lot more than you play them today. He had to play against guys like Nate Thurman. He had to play against guys like Zelmo Beatty. And today, if he was in the league, because of the three-point shot, I still think he'd be a great player because, again, you want dunks or threes. You don't want the mid-level jumper anymore. The mid-level jumper, Oscar was probably the greatest mid-level jump shooter of all time, averaged, like 49% from the floor when the league average was 40.
Right.
Now people say, he only averaged this or that, but hold it now. You got to look at what the league average was back then.
Right.
So I agree on the Wilt thing, but the notion that he would be out of a top 10, honorable mention, whatever, just strikes. Now, everybody had him in the top 10, so I can't criticize that's an Oscar argument. But again, you'd have to look at real early tape to see how athletic this guy was, and that would clearly translate to today.
All right, in our last few minutes here, let me jump in with the unified theory, which I think is he was unlucky from a historical perspective not to be born later, because then we could have seen and there wouldn't have been any question what he would have done against different kinds of competition. So I do sort of see both sides of the coin with what you guys were saying there. The fact that I had Wilt rated 5th on my ballot, I'm closer to where you're at on that one, Steve, but I see the other point of view as well. You look at the top two guys on this list, it's unsurprising. It's the debate that sort of kick-started this whole project in the first place. 619 points in second place, LeBron James. 662 points in first place, Michael Jordan. The ballots for each of them. For LeBron, I had him third, Ron had him second, Dave had him second, Steve had him fourth, Ben had him third, Chris had him first, Jason had him first, Michael Jordan, I had him first, Ron had him first, Dave had him first, Steve had him third, Ben had him first, Chris had him second, and Jason had him second. On my ballot for LeBron, because he seems to be the bigger debate point of the two. Jordan it always seems to be Jordan or somebody in the conversation here, and that the variable at the moment is LeBron, and where do you slot LeBron? And when I did my ballot, I said LeBron is a moving target. His career isn't over yet. He's on pace to have a longer prime than most guys generally have, which as an all-time great makes the case even stronger. I think I said if he wins 2 more titles, that would be double digits in the finals as far as appearances go. He never went out in the first round the way that Jordan did. It's a little easier to be 6-0 in the finals when you've lost on smaller stages earlier in your career, as Jordan tended to do. We remember LeBron's eliminations because they tended to be later in the playoffs. 5 titles, double digits finals appearances, along with everything that he has done in terms of his all-around game. I think he probably, because of his physicality, surpasses Oscar Robertson as the best all-around player of all time as far as skill set goes, because having that mailman Malone body to add with the Oscar Robertson skill set gives that extra dimension. Almost unparalleled court vision among guys on this list, although in fairness, Larry Bird is a guy who's very underrated in that as well when we're talking about that. So my sense is LeBron's not where Oscar is yet. LeBron's not where Jordan is yet, but he just turned 33. You give it some time, he has a chance to become number one, not for another 3 or 4 years. Jason said on his ballot he thinks LeBron's already there. He doesn't even necessarily know that it's an argument. I certainly disagree with him on that. So I'll start with you, Steve. You were a little bit of an outlier here as far as having LeBron 3 and Jordan 4. You didn't have either of them in your top 2. You're the one guy where that was the case. So I'll start with you before I throw it to Chris.
Well, I guess I would say I still have Jordan above LeBron for some of the reasons you just enunciated. But while I did point out 6-0 in the NBA Finals and 6-0 Finals MVP, again, you have to remember the context of the times. The East was terrible back then. He was beating Patrick Ewing and nobody. You know, whatever anyone thinks of Ewing, he didn't play with an all-star his entire career. They were beating Reggie Miller and the Pacers and nobody. So every year, to me, he had a clear way to the finals. And meanwhile, the West was beating each other up. And you remember, the Jazz, of course, and Elijah Wan and the Rockets, and even Seattle with Sean Kemp and Gary I mean, there were some bomb teams in the West. So they used to beat each other up. My knock on Jordan, and I'll include this as a knock on LeBron as well, neither one was a very good three-point shooter. LeBron in his entire career has not even been an average three-point shooter. He's doing well this year. This might be the first year. But if you look at the stats vis-a-vis whatever really good three-point shooters are, and more importantly what the NBA average is, LeBron has always been around 33%, and that leaves him behind. He's higher this year. Jordan as well. Jordan averaged 32.7% from three. The league average back then was lower, as again you would expect, because the three-point came in the mid-late 80s. So Jordan was around the league average. But to me, and I've said this to my son numerous times, when LeBron James is consistently hitting his outside shot, he is the greatest player ever. As a player. I'm not talking about the championship. As a player, I also have told him they're not playing singles tennis in the NBA. So while Russell is the greatest winner, and I rank him very high, others don't, this isn't about one guy. Basketball is not a one-on-one game. So I give more credence to a guy like an Oscar who had to go play with Kareem. Would Magic have won all the titles he won if he didn't play with Kareem? I don't know. So my knock on them, big picture, is neither of them are great shooters.
That's
very
true.
clutch players, etc. The other thing I'll say is Jordan never won anything without Pippen. And what I did say about LeBron, and I have Jordan 3 and LeBron 4, is essentially what you said, Rick, and that is this guy has taken some of the worst teams in history to the NBA Finals. So when you look at LeBron's long-term record in the Finals, you have to say, in my view, that he got teams who had no business being near the Finals. They shouldn't have been conference champions, that early team in Cleveland that got swept, for example. So my view on LeBron is yours. Give him more time. See how many more championships he can win. But vis-a-vis him and Jordan as not the greatest players of all time, to me, if you're not a center, and as we've talked now, there used to be dominant ones, there aren't many now. If you're not a center, to me, you better be a real good shooter. When Durant goes up from three, you think he's making it.
Right.
When Curry shoots from three, you think he's making it.
Right.
I'm not comparing Curry to Jordan and LeBron. Durant has a chance to get there, but my point is, when LeBron goes up for a big three, you want him to shoot. And he still has not disproven that, although this year I think he's at the highest level of his career. So those would be more knocks because everybody's picking them 1-2. I'm picking them 3-4 with Jordan on top. Those are the reasons why.
Right. Okay, in terms of LeBron, too, first team in Cleveland I agree with you on. Every other time he's been to the finals, Miami or Cleveland, though, it's been a big three team. So I agree with you on the first one. That was a carry job like what Iverson did in 01 with the Sixers. The other teams, he did have a lot of, maybe not depth.
But Rick, a couple of years ago, he lost those guys, and they still won 2 games against Golden State. That was a miracle.
Okay. Those guys were hurt. I do agree with that. That's an excellent point as well. I just meant as far as getting to the finals, but you're right about that. Chris, in our final minutes here, bring it home. Your thoughts on this. You were a guy that had LeBron at 1 over Jordan at 2 already at this stage in his career.
Yeah, and a lot of that is based on projecting, figuring he plays another 5 or 6 years, and where he'll be statistically. I'm not even going to focus so much on the finals number of championships. LeBron has carried 8 teams to the finals, which to me is amazing. Yes, he's only won 3 of them. You just referenced the fact that a couple of years ago against Golden State, no Kevin Love, no Kyrie. And he should have been the MVP of that final, even though Cleveland lost. The fact of the matter is, in that final, he showed his greatness in terms of how far he carried that team and how close they were to upsetting Golden State in that first go around in that finals. At that point, they had no business winning that thing, and they came close, and it was only because of LeBron. He got robbed, and he only didn't get the MVP because they didn't win in some weird mentality that sports writers have that you've got to be on the winning team in order to win the MVP. I'm just looking at, how long their careers have been. LeBron has now played more regular season games, and when you start to look at their statistics, they're very comparable. I think LeBron does a lot more overall on the court than what Jordan did in terms of his versatility. Yes, they're both not the best shooters. When both Jordan and LeBron are on, they are just lethal. And I think over the next 5 or 6 years, LeBron, I think, will certainly distance himself in terms of his value to a team game, how he elevates his teams versus Jordan. It's true, Jordan didn't win anything without Pippen. If you put, Jordan on that first Cavs team that went and lost to San Antonio, did that get to the finals? I don't know. I'm not convinced of that. I think LeBron is just such a Swiss Army knife and can do so much on the court. As much as I am not a fan of him in terms of some of his off the court, and not that he gets into trouble, but the tweeting and all these different things he mentions on social media to try to quote unquote motivate teammates, or sort of occasional spoiled baby mentality that Jordan never would have had. I don't like any of that stuff out of LeBron. I mean, to me, it just does scream that, like, hey, I may look like I'm 50, but I'm really a millennial. And I just, as you can probably tell, Steve, I'm not the biggest LeBron fan, but over time I've sort of been worn down by watching how he elevates a team and those around him in a way that I've never seen another player. I look at when LeBron went to Miami and you had that Cleveland team the next year, which was basically the same roster, then turn around and won like 11 games.
Right. Good point.
Without him. Yep. And, I mean, if you want to know the value of it, are you telling me that LeBron was basically worth 50 games, 50 victories, basically? Yep. I mean, that's basically what he was worth. Has there ever been another player in the league that you would say this guy is worth 50 wins to a team? I mean, you start to break it down, and the level of competition that he's playing against in terms of the quality of players, the fact that he's never missed much time in terms of any kind of injury, never had a serious injury. It really is amazing. It truly is amazing, and it's, I think, only when he's done, like, say, in 6 or 7 years, we'll all look back and go, wow. Like, once the stat book is closed and we have the full story of who LeBron is as a player, I believe that these lists will become more about, LeBron and then who's really number 2, Michael or Oscar or Kareem. And that's why I voted the way I did.
I think that may very well be the case, and I'll leave it on this note here that, again, you and I, Chris, we've been able to see it up close for much of LeBron's career, aside from the unfortunate donut hole years in Miami, I would say, as a Clevelander, but we've been able to see it all up close. I remember before Game 4 in the finals in 2015, you and I were texting about this. You were going to the game, and I said, man, if Steve Kerr just stays in that Soma coma for one more game, we got this. I knew we had to take Game 4. We didn't. But we weren't going to blow a 3-1 lead, I'll tell you that. Only Golden State was going to do that in the finals a year later. But it was really something, the job that he did carrying the Cavs to a 6-game loss in 2015, as has been the job that you guys have done with this discussion today of the NBA top 10 players of all time, the lists that we did, and it ended up being 25 players overall on our list. I want to thank you both so much for being part of this, a very worthy FDH Lounge 11th anniversary segment. Steve Kallas, thank you so much for being a part of this, lending your expertise to this, your thoughts, the ballot that you submitted, your thoughts today.
No, just fantastic to do this with you guys. It was a lot of fun. I think maybe there is a bit of a generation gap, maybe. Maybe that's my fault. But I like those final comments by Chris on the top 2 because he makes a good point, especially in terms of LeBron, who, he can go out tomorrow and guard the point guard or he could guard the center. And that's really an incredible skill to have. We'll have to see. I hope we reconvene in, 5 years after LeBron retires? And we can do this again. But it was great to do this with you guys.
We'll do this again, and I'll make sure it's this grouping. It's the first time that I've put you two guys together here, but the FDH chessboard is awesome, and it is deep, and I can mix and match at will, I think, and have a great pairing, as was the case today. Chris has been a part of a number of pairings over the years as an original FDH Lounge dignitary, 11 years and counting. Thank you so much, as always, my man.
Thank you, sir. It was great, Steve. I look forward to doing it again.
Same here.
Excellent. We'll clip and save on that note, people. We'll revisit over a period of time, and I'll certainly put these guys together on some other subjects as well. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, being a part of this very special 11th anniversary mini episode, number 950 in the FDH Lounge.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, Waitresses, Strippers, Bartenders, Garbage Men, Janitors, Microwave Popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and The Periodic Table of Elements.